Welcome to this week's edition of Focus on Connecticut. I'm Tom Appleby, and just when you thought the legislative session was over and the budget had been put to bed, it wasn't. So this week the lawmakers were back up at Hartford, and now, supposedly, allegedly, it has been put to bed. Let me introduce our guest to you to talk about this issue. State Senator Tony Boucher is a Republican representing the 26th District, which includes Bethel, New Canaan, Reading, Ridgefield, Weston, Westport, and Wilton. And Tony Backer's a state representative, a Democrat, the 121st District. Terry Backer, what did I say, Tony? Too many Tonys.
We do that all the time.
Terry Backer, Democrat, 121st District, Stratford. Thank you both for coming by. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Tom.
And I'm sure it's a pleasure to say goodbye to Hartford for a little bit, at least.
Absolutely.
Has anyone heard from these four corporations who screamed bloody murder when the first budget iteration passed and they said this is just not tenable and we're thinking of leaving? Has there been any feedback since you adjusted things, tweaked it, so to speak?
Well, I hear from all of them all the time. I have Boehringer Ingelheim in my district. I have GE employees throughout my district. I have IBM.
GE is based in Fairfield?
Absolutely. We have so many employees of the companies, from the CEO and CFO all the way down to the individuals that work in the reception area.
Did you get a pat on the back?
Absolutely not. All this budget did was basically delay the really onerous parts of this particular budget that really hurts them and has caused them to look around, shop around, and have so many other states. In fact, we even have the governor of Florida come right here to Norwalk to come and pitch and poach our companies.
Did you hear anything from constituents saying, these corporations are so huge, they make so much money, what right have they to tell our state lawmakers what to do with the budget?
Actually, I did not really hear very much of that. I did hear from any number of constituents who either work for GE or another company, or may have relatives who work for another company, stressing dismay. Hey, why are we taxing these people out of existence? In some regards, some of it is very true. In some others, there's not. I have heard in our machinations during the budget and asking certain questions that GE actually paid no corporate income tax to the state of Connecticut last year. Now, of course, they're paying municipal property taxes, and they're paying taxes. People are paying taxes on incomes and things of that nature. But apparently, their model. Let me put it this way. When the CEO of a publicly traded corporation comes out and says something, it's highly scrutinized. People are paying attention. Federal trade, stock market, people are paying attention to what they say. I don't think they come out and say that as an idle threat. You might hear it from a lobbyist, you might hear it from someone else. When the CEO says something, you have to pay attention. There are other states that are willing to forego the taxable revenue or whatever they deem may be available for the jobs.
That's right.
They're willing to forego that for the jobs.
Absolutely. I back Terry Backer on that completely, because he's absolutely right. This was very unusual. Big companies really tried to, stay low and not cause a lot of controversy.
They've got lobbyists. Much of what's done with the budget is done behind closed doors. And in this case, it was so public.
Well, I will tell you this. It wasn't public. A lot of the negotiations on this budget actually was behind closed doors.
I mean, the corporations making statements.
Oh, they usually never come out publicly like this. Absolutely not. So things are really, really critical. And let me tell you, if GE or other companies didn't even pay 1 red cent in corporate taxes, GE alone spends $14 billion with Connecticut companies just within our state. That's why every other state is chomping at the bit to come here and try to see if they can lure them to their states. I was just listening to NPR this morning, and they were talking about Puerto Rico and with the dire straits that this territory is in. They're losing so many people, and they said the number one reason is jobs. They're fleeing to the United States because of jobs, and as a result, there are very fewer people to pay down their debt, and their debt is to the point where they have to declare bankruptcy. Well, Connecticut is finding itself in the same fix, and instead of fixing what's wrong, literally this time, and even after a governor promised not to raise taxes. Again, we had the second highest tax increase in the history of the state, nearly $2 billion raised in higher taxes. And let me tell you, it's just not the unitary tax that these large corporations, the unitary tax would have them report on all their sales outside of Connecticut and at some point tax them further here. It's also the personal income tax is being raised almost 7%, and this is just not large corporations
on the higher
bracket.
Yeah.
And not only does that hurt, say, a person that controls where his jobs are located or her jobs are located, it hurts those small businesses in our state because they actually are taxed based on their personal income for their small business.
Let me worry about News 12 Connecticut's income for just a moment. We'll take a break. When we come back, let's talk about this isn't going away. As you pointed out, one of these taxes is down the road. It will be implemented.
Exactly.
How are we going to get out of this? We'll talk about that right after this. Welcome back to Focus on Connecticut. During the break, our lawmakers were talking about the fact that the budget did do some good, quote, stuff, and later on we'll talk about that stuff. But let's talk about this big problem. In 2 years, when this budget is said and done, we face a more than $800 million deficit. Mm-hmm. So even with all that we've done, it's not going away. And we've hurt social services to some degree, one of the most painful things for lawmakers and, of course, the people who take advantage of those services. Where can we make the cuts? Where can we do what has to be done to balance these budgets?
You know, state government does provide for a large number of needs within the state, whether it's something as every day we all use every day, whether it's transportation infrastructure, which is not in great shape. It's getting old. And there's a lot more use of it than it was ever designed for. We have a lot of the social services. We have more and more elderly people, and we have a higher Medicaid load to deal with in terms of cost and delivering services. So when people say, like, why would you cut social services? The problem is so much of the money actually goes to social services of things, and then we have to continue to help various municipalities with their education systems, and so we have a population that's grown, and with it has grown the needs and the demands on infrastructure and the demands on health systems, and how do you get out of that? Greater minds than mine have tried to find ways to develop those services cheaper, less expensive. And
I expect you to think those minds are on your side of the aisle.
Well, in fact, that's a good point, Tom. We actually have proposed alternative budgets since 2011, detailed line-by-line budgets. We've done that. And let's face it, other states have the very same needs that we do. They have social services issues and the disabled that they need to take care of. And they do. And in fact, they do it, many of them, without a state income tax, without inheritance taxes, gift taxes, car taxes, pension taxes, and so on. And they're the ones that are getting people to move there. That's the problem. And in this particular budget proposal, when the governor proposed it, he didn't actually deal with the structural problems that we have in the costs. Instead, he cut all of these areas and had everyone screaming uncle. And as a result, now we have a budget that still doesn't deal with the elephant in the room, and you know what those are. There were $200 million of union concessions that were never realized, that were promised previous to this budget. And even in this budget, the governor says, well, I'm not sure if we're going to get anything from the state employees just this morning, I understand. And you know what? That is the group that has actually benefited, the only group that has benefited in these budgets that we've seen. And that is wrong. Other states say what they do. I know in Florida, the governor there stated that what he does is he measures the costs out of every single services there is. And if there's an increase proposed in a particular program, he wants to see where they're going to decrease it somewhere else. That makes sense. You know, you have to run it like a business because their number one priority is jobs. Everything else falls under that. And if you increase the jobs and expand the tax base, you can keep taxes lower because those revenues will increase. That's the true dynamics, and that's where Connecticut misses the boat.
So what about the state employees?
To my knowledge, and I understand that an agreement was made where there would be a certain amount of give back, and Tony referenced the $250 million. It was more than that. I guess some of it was given back in terms of concessions and for promises of no layoffs. And from what I understand, that they are $250 million short in coming up with their side of the deal. Without state employees, we don't run a state, but we have to. If they're going to make an agreement to protect their members in terms of layoffs and things like that, then we want them to deliver just as they would expect us to deliver on contractual agreements.
And to be fair, those agreements, we've seen them under Republican governors and Democratic governors. It's not a partisan issue.
Absolutely. And in fact, Jody Rell was able to get $700 million of concessions just by making very small changes. And Governor Malloy did that as well. But they didn't really deal with the big issues. The things that a state like Rhode Island, a Democratic state with a Democratic treasurer, now she became governor, that actually looked at that and said, listen, this is unsustainable. So they did some things to change so that they can bring their income tax lower than ours. They wanted to bring it down to 5.9 so that they could be competitive with Connecticut. And they had to sit down in an honest discussion because you want to talk to the state employees and show them how their pensions, their future security is at risk. Connecticut is more at risk than almost any other state right now. We're funding those pensions and those benefits at 42%. 42%. Tom, the standard is 85%. We're headed for a structural, continuous, looming deficits as far as the eye can see. That is not sustainable. All Connecticut has done is kick the can down the road each time. For political expediency, that's not the way to run a state.
I'm going to kick this discussion down the road for just a break, and when we come back, let's talk about that good stuff you were talking about. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Focus on Connecticut. As you can see, the discussion continues during the break. Let me reintroduce our guest to you. State Representative Terry, a.k.a. Tony Backer, is a Democrat from the 121st District, which is Stratford, and State Senator Tony Boucher, Republican from the 26th District. 7 communities. I'm going to leave them out so we can get to the issues here. The good stuff. Well, you mentioned transportation, that it's been a problem. The governor made this the hallmark of this session, and you did take steps towards improving transportation.
My concern about transportation in general, as we look around, we talk about just revitalizing the bridges that cross our many rivers. It's hundreds of millions of dollars every time you get into one of those. And part of me can't help but question, are we just preparing for a mode of transportation that's now 120 years old? Not that cars are going to go anywhere, they're still going to be here, but what are we looking at in terms of revitalizing or recreating a new transportation system, whether it's the light rail or whatever, which, by the way, we had a state-of-the-art light rail system in Connecticut at one time. It was called the trolley system. May have been a little cruder, but it went everywhere, and it was an inexpensive way to get around. And I just came down from Stratford to Norwalk, and the morning commute through Bridgeport and Fairfield is a crawl through there. It's costing productivity, fuel, and certainly you can see people doing this.
I should point out that we're taping this Wednesday morning because of the holiday. If we had taped it Friday morning, you'd had no problem at all.
Yeah, right.
So
Yeah.
Well,
so
good-
We'd have
good
to. We've
stuff.
been on Skype.
but we're not going anywhere. The cars are here to stay. The trains
Right.
are here to stay. So this is
Yes.
$100 million $1 billion over 30 years is what the governor wants, and a chunk of that is in this
$100
budget.
billion, absolutely. I think that's one area where there's so much agreement. We all believe that infrastructure is key, transportation is key for businesses too. That's one of their top priorities. And there's a lot of desire to be around a transportation hub. I think that's why Stanford does so well around the Stanford train station. There's as many folks coming from New York for jobs in Stanford as is going out. So it's key. Some of the things I really supported in this budget too was that they didn't forget about our branch lines, our New Canaan line, our Danbury to Norwalk line, and our even Waterbury line and other parts. Those are usually the step children of the state's DOT. So that
We
was
get
being
reports
addressed.
every day. The buses
Yes.
will take you because
Yes,
the trains aren't.
exactly. So there needs to be focus on it. Where we disagree is how to pay for it. Well, I have good news because you know how much, Tom, I have opposed tolls this entire session. And some thought it was a foregone conclusion, but guess what? That did not pass at the end of the day. It was forced through the Transportation Committee. I'm a ranking member on the Senate side. I debate my chairman of that Senate on the Democratic side. He and I get along famously. In fact, you know, really unusually well for Hartford. But on this point is where we really disagreed. And the good news, it's not in there right now. So it's
Where
been
are you
delayed.
on- Stratford was where that horrific accident took
Right.
place, and that's why tolls are gone in Connecticut. Where do you stand on that?
You know, I'm almost mixed emotions and torn on it because I-95 through Connecticut is probably some of the most traveled through roadways in the country. It's a byway that takes traffic through New York and into Massachusetts to Boston and points east. So a lot of it is, of course, we have a tremendous amount of local traffic, but a lot of the traffic moving through the state neither stops to buy anything here. Many of the truckers try to time their fuel to get it in different states where it's less expensive. So a lot of the traffic's moving through. We deal with the wear and tear on the road, the air pollution, the congestion. And when I think in that regard, I think entrance and exit tolls may not be a bad idea. Certainly in theory and with the technology we have today, not that everyone would necessarily invest in the technology in terms of individuals, but I think that at some point we are accruing a tremendous cost, both in quality of life, environment, and in the expenses of the roads being pounded to pieces by all the vehicle traffic that passes through Connecticut. Doesn't stop, doesn't go get a hamburger in your town. If it does anything, it'll grab a hamburger on 95 and go on. Doesn't really help our communities. We need the road, and a lot of products do stop here, but it is still one of the most traveled through states in the nation.
So that's something we didn't do. We're going to take one last break, and when we come back, I'll let you dictate what the good stuff was in this budget. One more break. Just a few minutes left. So, when you go to your constituents and they grouse about this budget, what do you say were the good things?
Well, there's some great education changes that were made that really were sensitive to, and was support on both sides of the aisle. One of the areas that was a good, I think, improvement was that allowing schools in our state to give the SAT instead of the Smarter Balance test that is associated with the Common Core curriculum. That's been very controversial, and I think that there was such a good effort made to change that.
Students were doubling
yes,
up and taking
absolutely,
both.
And it's much preferable for the SAT to be used instead, and it helps almost every community for sure. Something called the minimum budget requirement, forcing towns that have a reduction in enrollment to spend as much or more than the year before. That's been changed for the top 10% of schools. It's still required for places like Bridgeport or New Haven or Hartford because again, they have a much more difficult, more challenging educational environment. So that was a change that actually reduced mandates slightly. We had a lot of good legislation with regards to early childhood development, concussions, dyslexia, approaching a lot of topics that everybody really cared about. And additionally, there was reform made to your electric bill and oil bills and that variable rate contracts that oftentimes lock people in, that really make their energy bill go up and down violently. This was actually changed and taken out.
Well, I think I just got hijacked on a lot of the good stuff that went through in the budget. Certainly, there is a element of very small, be it and property tax relief dealing with cars in certain municipalities where, what is the mill rate? Is it has to be over 35?
Oh, well, yes, it's right about, yes, 32 was the mill rate. If you're above that, and Bridgeport, I think, is 44. And there are, a lot of our towns are 14, 17, they're lower.
Yeah.
That's right.
So we had people in the cities, inner cities, paying higher taxes on their cars than people
it would
living
affect
in
my
suburban
community in Stratford, as you know. How the valuations are from town to town may be different, but yeah. And someone said, was it really that much money? If it's at $50 or $75, it wasn't as if when someone was knocking $1,000 off your house tax. But my thought of it was, if I walked up to you on the street and said, "Hey, I got $50. I don't need it. I don't want it. Take it," you'd probably take it. Well, wondering what the heck I was up to, but you'd probably take it. So. Well, I don't think it's earth-shattering. It's certainly something that someone can put in their pocket, and rather than take it out of their pocket. So I was supportive of that. And there's some other things that were in the budget that are not necessarily budget-related. It's a little. You
had the juvenile justice. You had second chance.
Well, some people's view of what's good is maybe another person's view of what's not so good.
It just wasn't budget related.
Something that I didn't, support.
Oh yeah, and it's all over. And I voted for the implementer because it did go in and look at any number of reasons, but it did reduce the data tax back to 1%. That will not affect Aetna.
This is one of the issues that had those.
One of the big issues. People
yeah.
who deal in information and data. This 3%. Was devastating. It was a huge impact, and that was enough to drive them off the edge to go to shift to a state. You're dealing with data. You don't even have to necessarily have the great big building towering up in Hartford anymore. And that would have cost thousands of jobs. So I was supportive of that. But I think Tony was right about this. Now, as someone who did vote for the budget, I do. A lot of this stuff is put on hold.
Yes.
And it's pretty clear, and I don't know.
I need to put this discussion on hold until the next time. I thank you both for coming. Happy holidays to you.
Oh, you too.
Okay.
Happy 4th of July.
Same to you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for joining us. Please stay tuned. The news continues.